What if the person you trusted most turned out to be hiding a dangerous secret? A seasoned police officer, Kaleb, and his partner Derek are called to a routine mission, but what they don't know is that tonight, nothing will go as planned. From a mysterious tip-off about a dangerous arms shipment to an unexpected ambush that sends them into a high-stakes game of survival, the line between good and evil begins to blur. As the night unfolds, secrets begin to surface, and they might be too much to handle, but here's the twist: what if, in a world where loyalty is everything, one of them isn't who they seem to be? Is Kaleb the hero Derek thinks he is, or is there something darker lurking beneath his calm, controlled demeanor? How far would you go to uncover the truth about someone you trust? Could your partner be someone entirely different than you believe? Comment below with your thoughts and predictions. What's really going on with Kaleb? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you're hooked already. Stay tuned for the next generation of this explosive story, because things are about to get even crazier. You won't want to miss what H. The rain came down hard, hammering the concrete jungle of downtown. Streets that had once been packed with cars now lay empty, drenched by a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to a mere few feet. In the midst of this chaos, Officer Derek Hayes pulled up in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the wet streets, his fingers clenched tightly around the steering wheel. He had always prided himself on his ability to navigate through dangerous situations, but tonight, things felt different. The usual hum of the city was replaced by an eerie stillness, as if the night was holding its breath. His radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 542, we have a 10-16 on 5th and Pine. The dispatcher's voice echoed in his earpiece: possible disturbance. Be advised, suspects are armed. Derek cursed under his breath, his heart rate picking up. The mention of firearms always triggered something primal in him. He'd been in enough shootouts to know how quickly things could escalate. Still, there was no time to hesitate. He was a cop, and it was his job to respond to these calls, no matter the risk. Roger that, dispatch. En route. He flicked the sirens on, the high-pitched wail slicing through the rain-soaked night. As his patrol car zoomed through the slick streets, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the lack of traffic or the sense of dread in the air. Either way, he had a job to do. And he would do it, no matter what. Turning onto 5th Street, Derek saw a group of figures standing under the dim light of a street lamp. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods, but one thing was clear: they weren't just standing there. They were armed. Derek slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his gun and radioed in: suspect spotted. I need backup now. His voice was urgent, the fear in his chest rising, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't about to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He stepped out of the car, his boots splashing in the growing puddles. The figures turned to face him, their eyes gleaming with malice. There were 4 of them, each holding a weapon. Derek's instincts kicked in. He wasn't going to wait for backup. He was going to handle this. He raised his gun, aiming directly at the nearest suspect, a tall figure with a scarred face. Drop the weapon, Derek commanded, his voice steady. The man sneered, and without warning, he fired a shot. Derek ducked behind his car, the bullet slamming into the door just inches from his head. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he returned fire, his hands steady despite the chaos. Another shot rang out, this time grazing the shoulder of one of the suspects. The group scattered, taking cover behind nearby vehicles. Derek's mind raced. He couldn't let them get away, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He needed a plan. His hand went to his radio, but before he could call for backup, another shot echoed through the night. This one was aimed at him, narrowly missing his chest as he dove to the side. Damn it, he muttered. His fingers fumbled as he pulled out his phone, hitting the emergency contact for backup. Just as he was about to press send, a voice echoed from behind him. It was deep, gravelly, and unmistakable: Derek. He spun around, heart racing, gun raised. There, standing in the shadows, was another figure. But this one wasn't a suspect. No, it wasn't a suspect at all. Who the hell are you? Derek demanded. His gun trained on the newcomer, the man stepped into the light, revealing himself. He was tall, with dark skin, his face stern but calm. A police badge gleamed from his belt, and he wore the uniform of the city's finest. Derek's eyes narrowed in confusion. The man wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be part of this operation. You're on the wrong side of the fence, Hayes, the man said quietly. I suggest you lower your weapon before things get out of hand. Derek's mind spun. This wasn't making sense. The man was a cop, but Derek had never seen him before. His confusion was quickly replaced with suspicion. The other suspects were still out there, and now this cop was just standing there, giving orders like he had control of the situation. I don't know you, Derek growled, eyes narrowing. Get the hell out of here. The stranger's expression didn't change. He didn't even flinch. I'm not here to fight you, Derek. I'm here to stop this. Before Derek could respond, one of the suspects from across the street opened fire again. Shots rang out in rapid succession, and Derek's body instinctively moved to take cover. The mysterious officer didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his own weapon and fired back, the sound of his shots echoing through the night. A few more seconds of chaos passed, and then everything went silent. Derek peeked around his car door and saw the suspects lying motionless on the wet pavement. The rain washed away the traces of gunfire, but the tension in the air lingered. Derek's gun was still aimed at the man, but his grip was looser now, his suspicion tempered by the sense of relief that filled his chest. The man lowered his weapon slowly, the movement deliberate. You've got a lot of questions, Derek, the man said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. I get it. But right now, you need to trust me. Derek hesitated, still unsure of what to make of this stranger. He wasn't sure who to trust in that moment, but one thing was certain, this wasn't the end of the night. Not by a long shot. Who the hell are you? Derek asked again, his voice low. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. You'll find out soon enough. Derek's mind raced as he leaned against the squad car, staring at the flickering neon lights across the street. The night's events had left a lingering tension in the air. He had been an officer long enough to know when things felt off, and tonight was one of those nights. His instincts were sharp, but they hadn't helped him figure out why Kaleb had acted so strangely when they received the call about the warehouse. Kaleb, always the picture of professionalism, had been distant. Cold, even. Kaleb had always been the kind of guy who kept his thoughts to himself. He was a no-nonsense officer, one who kept his emotions buried deep beneath the surface. But there was something about his behavior tonight that felt different, something that made Derek's unease grow by the second. He couldn't shake the feeling that Kaleb was hiding something. They had received intel about a large shipment of illegal arms being delivered to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was supposed to be a standard bust, nothing too extraordinary. But when Kaleb had received the call to meet at the warehouse, he had seemed distracted, as though he knew something Derek didn't. Derek shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. Focus, he muttered to himself. He glanced back at Kaleb, who was standing across the street, surveying the area with his usual intensity. Kaleb was always in control, always prepared. But tonight, something was different, as they started to move toward the warehouse. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. The sound of their boots echoed in the quiet night air as they approached the large, unmarked building. Kaleb, always the tactician, motioned for Derek to take cover behind a nearby dumpster. Stay low, Kaleb whispered, his voice sharp but steady. We need to observe before we rush in. The intel we received doesn't line up with the usual operation. Something's off, Derek nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The city had long since fallen into a peaceful silence, the only sound coming from the distant hum of traffic. There were no lights on at the warehouse. Nothing out of the ordinary to indicate that something suspicious was going on inside. But Kaleb's unease was palpable, and that made Derek uneasy as well. The two officers crouched in the shadows, watching the building from their position. They waited, analyzing every movement they could see through the cracks in the dumpster. Kaleb was tense, his eyes constantly darting from the building to the surrounding street. I don't like this, Kaleb muttered, more to himself than to Derek. The timing's all wrong. Derek squinted into the distance. What do you mean? Kaleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up slightly, adjusting his position to get a better view of the entrance. Derek followed suit, careful to stay quiet. Kaleb's hand moved instinctively to his side, checking the holster where his gun rested. A small motion, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Something's going on here that I can't quite figure out, Kaleb continued, his voice a low growl. But we need to be ready for anything. Before Derek could respond, a car pulled up to the front of the warehouse. A black sedan, unmarked, rolled to a stop in the shadows of the building. A man got out, tall and broad-shouldered, with a suit that screamed authority. He glanced around quickly, ensuring no one was nearby. before walking toward the warehouse entrance. Derek's heart skipped a beat. The man had the look of someone who didn't care about being discreet. Someone who knew the stakes and was willing to take risks. Derek exchanged a look with Kaleb. What the hell? Who's that? Caleb's expression remained unreadable. Not sure, but we're about to find out. Stay sharp. Derek wanted to argue, wanted to ask more questions, but now wasn't the time. The man had disappeared into the building, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. The quiet was oppressive, as if the city itself was holding its breath. For a moment, neither officer moved. They waited, hearts pounding, as the minutes ticked by. Then, almost as if on cue, the sound of a door opening came from the far side of the warehouse. Kaleb motioned for Derek to follow him. They moved quickly and silently, staying in the shadows as they approached the building. Kaleb led the way, his movements precise, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Derek followed, his breath shallow as they got closer to the entrance, but just as they were about to round the corner, a voice called out from the darkness, "Stop right there." Kaleb froze, and Derek felt his heart leap into his throat. They were caught. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask. He held a rifle at the ready, pointing it directly at Kaleb and Derek. Kaleb raised his hands slowly, his expression calm despite the tense situation. "We're here for the shipment. We're with the police." The man didn't lower the rifle. Instead, he grinned beneath his mask. "I don't think so." Before Derek could react, Kaleb moved in an instant, his hand gripping the man's wrist, twisting it with a practiced motion. The rifle fell to the ground with a loud clatter, but the man didn't scream. He only let out a grunt of frustration as Kaleb brought him to the ground with a swift, calculated takedown. Derek watched in stunned silence. Kaleb hadn't hesitated for even a second. His movements were sharp, professional, and terrifyingly efficient. The kind of efficiency that could only come from someone who had seen more than their fair share of combat. Kaleb stood up, dusting his hands off as if the encounter had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "That was too easy," he muttered, his voice steady. Derek didn't know what to say. Kaleb had always been a professional, but the way he had handled the situation was chilling. His calm demeanor, the speed with which he disarmed the man, all of it felt like something Derek wasn't prepared for. "What now?" Derek asked, trying to shake off the unease settling in his chest. Caleb's eyes flashed, the briefest flicker of something dark crossing his features. "We go inside. We finish this." Derek had never seen Kaleb look this determined, or this cold. His gut twisted as they moved toward the entrance of the warehouse. This mission, whatever it was, had just become a lot more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Derek was out of breath, his chest heaving with exertion. His hands were still tightly gripping his gun, the barrel smoking from the last rounds he'd fired. The firefight had come to an abrupt end, but the air was still thick with tension. The van had disappeared into the night, vanishing into the labyrinth of city streets, leaving Derek and Kaleb standing in the middle of the chaos. Derek's eyes scanned the street, the wet pavement reflecting the flashing lights of nearby police vehicles. The distant hum of sirens grew louder, but none of it seemed to matter. His mind was racing, filled with questions he couldn't begin to answer. Kaleb was already moving again, his body fluid and quick, as though he were a man on a mission. Derek couldn't keep up with him, not mentally, anyway. Kaleb was miles ahead, and Derek was still stuck in the moment they'd just survived. "Hey!" Derek shouted, jogging after him. "What the hell is going on? Who were those guys? And why the hell didn't you tell me what you were involved in?" Kaleb didn't slow down. He didn't even look back. "Get in the car," he called over his shoulder. His tone was calm but commanding, as if he had no time for questions. He reached his vehicle, which was parked a few feet away, and jumped in without hesitation. Derek paused, unsure. His instincts screamed at him to run after Kaleb, to demand answers. But something about the way Kaleb handled the situation, so composed, so controlled, suggested that Derek wasn't ready for the truth. Swallowing his pride, Derek climbed into the passenger seat of Caleb's car. He slammed the door, his fingers gripping the seat as the engine roared to life. Kaleb sped off, weaving in and out of traffic with ease, his eyes fixed ahead, never pausing. Those men were mercenaries. Hired muscle. They were sent here to clean up something that got out of hand. "What the hell does that mean?" Derek demanded, his pulse still racing from the gunfire. He couldn't let go of the fact that they'd almost died, and now Kaleb was telling him it was all part of some bigger mess. means we're in deep haze, Kaleb replied, his voice still level, though there was a hint of something dangerous lurking beneath it. And I've got no time to explain it all to you right now. Derek's mind was spinning, trying to piece together what he'd just witnessed. Caleb's words didn't sit right. I don't get it. You're telling me some mercenaries just tried to kill us because they're part of some, what? Some bigger operation. You don't just take a random cop out like that. There's more to this. Kaleb turned his head for just a moment, his cold eyes locking onto Derek's. Trust me, he said, his voice hardening. If you want to stay alive, you need to keep your mouth shut and follow my lead. You're already in this, whether you like it or not. Derek couldn't shake the weight of those words. He felt as if he had stepped into something far darker than anything he had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. Kaleb had made it clear that Derek was already a part of whatever twisted game was being played. Caleb's car sped through the rain-soaked streets, taking sharp turns and moving faster than Derek thought possible. The tension between them grew as the silence stretched out, both men trapped in their own thoughts. Derek didn't know what to say anymore. His questions were piling up, but he wasn't sure if he even wanted to know the answers. After several minutes of driving through the winding city streets, Kaleb pulled into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building looked dilapidated, the windows boarded up, and the place was eerily quiet. Kaleb parked the car and killed the engine. Get out, Kaleb said simply. We need to talk. Derek hesitated but followed Caleb's lead. He got out of the car and followed the other officer toward the entrance of the warehouse. The cold night air bit at his skin as they approached the rusty metal doors. Kaleb didn't stop to unlock it. Instead, he pushed the door open with a grunt, revealing a dark interior. The only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead. The warehouse was huge, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. There was a heavy smell of dust and rust, and the floor beneath Derek's boots echoed with every step. Sit, Kaleb ordered, gesturing to a small table in the corner of the room. A single chair sat across from it. Derek glanced at the room, still trying to make sense of everything, and sat down reluctantly. Kaleb didn't waste time. He pulled up a chair and sat across from him, his eyes fixed on Derek. You're wondering what the hell this is all about, Kaleb said. I can see it in your eyes. Derek nodded, finally feeling like he could speak without his voice trembling. Yeah, no kidding. You dropped me into a firefight with no explanation, then tell me some mercenaries are after us, and now we're in some creepy warehouse. What the hell is going on, Kaleb? Who are these people? Kaleb leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples for a moment as if the weight of the situation was bearing down on him. I don't have time to sugarcoat it, he said slowly. There's a covert operation in this city. High-level stuff. People you'd never expect. I'm part of a task force investigating a secret criminal syndicate. But it's deeper than that. Deeper? How much deeper can it go? Derek asked, his voice incredulous. You're a cop, Kaleb. What kind of mess are you wrapped up in? Caleb's eyes hardened, and his voice dropped to a low growl. The kind that can cost you everything. Your job. Your freedom. Your life. Derek swallowed hard. There it was again, the threat, lingering in the air. He couldn't ignore it. Something was going on, and it was way bigger than he could have imagined. Kaleb stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I didn't want you involved, Hayes. But now you are. And there's no turning back. Derek stood, his legs shaking slightly. What now? Caleb's eyes met his with an intensity that left no room for doubt. We go after them. We finish this. Together. Derek's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what the hell Kaleb was talking about, but the moment was clear. The game had changed, and there was no going back. As Kaleb turned toward the shadows of the warehouse, Derek felt the weight of the choice before him. The fight wasn't over. The silence in the warehouse was oppressive as Kaleb paced the floor, his boots echoing in the cavernous space. Derek could feel the intensity of the moment settling in his chest. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about making choices that could very well determine whether they lived or died. Kaleb had told him enough to make Derek realize how deep this was. The criminal syndicate they were up against wasn't just a local gang or a few bad apples trying to make a quick buck. No, this was something far more organized, far more dangerous. A shadow organization, operating under the radar, pulling the strings in ways Derek couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now, he was part of it. Whether he liked it or not, Kaleb stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto Derek. "You're still with me, right?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. He was used to being in control, and Derek wasn't sure if he was more annoyed at the situation or the lack of answers. "I don't know what the hell you've gotten me into, but yeah, I'm still with you," Derek muttered, trying to hide the doubt creeping into his voice. There was no turning back. He had already risked his life once tonight, and there was no way he was walking away now. Kaleb didn't flinch at Derek's words. Instead, he pulled out a worn map from his jacket pocket and slapped it onto the table between them. The edges were frayed, and the ink was faded in places, but the key locations were still visible. It was clear this wasn't just any map, it was a layout of the city, with certain areas marked in red. "This is the layout of their operations in the city," Kaleb said, tapping one of the red markers. "We've been tracking their movements for months. But they're smart. They cover their tracks. Every time we think we're getting close, they vanish. And now they've upped the ante. They've put a target on our backs." Derek leaned over the table, squinting at the map. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the maze of marked areas, all the little spots of red that indicated some kind of operation or safe house. It was like a spider's web, each strand leading to a different part of the city. Kaleb pointed to one of the areas near the center of the city. "This is where we're headed. It's their primary hub. Their base of operations. If we can take it down, we cripple the entire network." Derek felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through him at the mention of an assault. "You want to hit their base? Are you insane? You've got to be kidding me." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and for the first time, Kaleb's face flickered with something like hesitation. "I'm not kidding," Kaleb said, his voice low and grave. "We don't have the luxury of playing it safe anymore. We're at war, Derek. And it's only going to get worse unless we strike first." Derek couldn't process the weight of Kaleb's words. The sheer audacity of what Kaleb was proposing, going directly after the syndicate's main operation, seemed impossible. But then again, this whole situation felt impossible. What was a cop like Kaleb doing, pulling Derek into this madness? Kaleb's eyes were unwavering. "If we do this, there's no turning back. They'll come for us, and they won't stop. They'll send everything they've got." Derek swallowed hard, trying to shake off the cold chill creeping up his spine. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. They could either wait and let the syndicate continue their operation. Or they could strike first, take the fight to them, and risk everything. "I didn't sign up for this," Derek muttered, his voice low. "I'm just trying to keep the city safe, Kaleb. I never thought I'd be going after some criminal empire." Kaleb's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a second. Then his eyes hardened again, and he slapped his hand on the table, making Derek jump. "None of us signed up for this. But here we are, and now we fight. You've already seen what they're capable of. They won't stop until they control everything. You want to save this city, don't you?" Derek clenched his jaw. "Of course I do. But there's got to be another way. We can't just charge in there with guns blazing." Kaleb shook his head. "There's no other way, Derek. We've been chasing shadows long enough. It's time to put an end to it. Tonight." Derek was about to protest again, but something in Kaleb's eyes made him pause. There was no turning back now. He could see the fire in Kaleb's eyes. He wasn't asking for Derek's approval. He was telling him what they had to do. They were in this together. Kaleb grabbed a backpack from the corner of the warehouse and tossed it to Derek. "Get geared up. We leave in 5. Derek caught the bag, his heart hammering. It felt like everything was happening so fast. The gravity of what they were about to do, taking on a criminal syndicate headfirst, settled in. The kind of men who had sent mercenaries after them were ruthless, and they had no intention of letting a couple of cops stand in their way. "I've been tracking their movement for weeks," Kaleb continued, moving toward a table littered with equipment. "But tonight, we hit them where it hurts. I know their weaknesses." "Yeah, and what happens if we fail?" Derek asked, his voice tight with fear. "What happens if we don't make it out of there?" Kaleb didn't flinch. His face remained calm, but his voice was resolute. "We make it out. Or we don't. But one thing's for sure, we're going to make them regret underestimating us." As Kaleb gathered his gear, Derek's mind raced. This wasn't just about a mission anymore. It was about survival. About fighting for something bigger than themselves. But the deeper they went into this, the more questions arose. What was Kaleb really hiding? Who was pulling his strings? And most importantly, what kind of man was Kaleb Mitchell, the cop who had just pulled him into a war against a criminal empire? Whatever it was, Derek was too deep now to back out. With a deep breath, he shouldered his gear, his eyes locking onto Kaleb. Let's do this. Kaleb nodded once, a cold, determined look on his face. The time for questioning was over, they were heading straight into the heart of the storm. The world outside the warehouse seemed like another lifetime as Derek and Kaleb geared up for the mission. Derek's hands moved mechanically, checking and rechecking his gear. His mind, however, was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He wasn't sure what kind of man Kaleb really was he just another officer caught up in a corrupt system, or was he something more? Something darker. They had barely spoken since the plan was set into motion. Kaleb had made it clear that there was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. And yet, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking blindly into a war, one he wasn't prepared for. Kaleb turned toward him, his voice cutting through the tension. We move in 2 minutes. Stick close. Stay sharp. Derek nodded, though his insides were a storm of nerves. His eyes drifted to the map again, trying to memorize the routes Kaleb had outlined. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Every step, every move had to be calculated, precise. This wasn't a simple raid. They were going up against a well-organized syndicate, with eyes everywhere. One wrong move, and it would all be over before it began. Kaleb had a plan, of that Derek was certain. But what else did he know? Who else was in on this operation? Derek didn't trust anyone anymore, not fully. Kaleb had been hiding something from him, and Derek could feel it in the way he carried himself. The way he spoke of the syndicate as if he knew more than he was letting on. They climbed into Kaleb's car and pulled away from the warehouse. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the windows like 1,000 tiny hammers. The city was dark, the streets slick with moisture, the lights reflecting in the pools of water that dotted the roads. It all felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. As they drove, the weight of the mission settled on Derek's shoulders. The farther they went, the more nervous he became. He had faced criminals before, faced down violent situations. But this felt different. They weren't just going after thugs or petty criminals. They were taking on a well-oiled machine. A network that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Kaleb didn't say much during the drive, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his grip steady on the wheel. Derek was tempted to ask questions again, but he knew better than to push. Kaleb wasn't in the mood for answers, he was in the mood for action. The city grew quieter the farther they got from the center. The streets narrowed, the buildings taller and more industrial. The air felt colder as they neared the edge of the district, where the real heart of the syndicate's operation was supposedly located. Kaleb slowed as they approached an unmarked building, a warehouse of sorts. It looked abandoned, but Derek knew better. This was the place. Kaleb parked the car a few hundred yards away, in the shadows of a nearby alley. They didn't need to draw attention. Quiet and efficient was the name of the game. Derek felt a pulse of adrenaline, his mind snapping into focus as Kaleb grabbed his gear and moved toward the building. We go in silent. No shooting unless it's absolutely necessary, Kaleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I've scouted this place. There's a guard out front, but he's not expecting company. Derek nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed Kaleb. Nothing about this felt right. It was too easy, too quiet. But Kaleb had led him this far, and Derek couldn't afford to second-guess him now. They moved like shadows, careful to avoid detection as they approached the building. Derek's heart pounded in his chest, each step heavier than the last. The door to the warehouse loomed ahead, unmarked, unassuming. It was just another industrial building in a sea of them, but Derek knew better than to trust appearances. Kaleb made a quick motion with his hand, signaling Derek to follow. He reached for the door handle, his movements smooth and deliberate. The door creaked open, just a crack. Kaleb slipped inside first, his body disappearing into the darkness. Derek followed close behind, his gun drawn and ready. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the shadows thick and oppressive. The air smelled stale, and the sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep within the structure. Derek's eyes adjusted to the low light as they moved further in, the quiet steps of their boots barely audible over the sound of the rain beating against the roof. Kaleb led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who had been here before. Derek kept close, his senses alert. He wasn't sure what they were walking into, but he was sure of one thing: things were about to get ugly. They reached a corner, and Kaleb stopped, motioning for Derek to stay back. He pressed his ear to the wall, listening intently. The sound of voices came from the next room, low murmurs, laughter. The clinking of bottles. The syndicate was here. They were just beyond that door, within arm's reach. Kaleb glanced back at Derek. "You ready for this?" Derek didn't hesitate. "As ready as I'll ever be." Kaleb nodded, then motioned for him to follow. With a deep breath, Kaleb kicked open the door, and the two men burst into the room, weapons raised. The moment they entered, the room went silent. Several men froze, their hands hovering over their weapons. The men were armed, some with pistols, others with rifles, but they didn't immediately open fire. Instead, they stared at the two officers, shock written on their faces. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Derek's finger tightened on the trigger. His body coiled and ready to spring into action. But Kaleb stepped forward, his gun still trained on the men, but his demeanor unyielding. "This is a raid," Kaleb said, his voice cold. "Drop your weapons. Now." The men didn't move at first, and for a moment, Derek thought they might actually fight. But then, one by one, they lowered their guns, the tension easing slightly. It wasn't over yet, but it was a small victory. Derek exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little, but that brief moment of calm didn't last. A voice from the back of the room broke the silence. "You think you can just walk in here and take us down?" The voice was smooth, confident. It belonged to someone who had no fear. Someone who was used to being in control. Kaleb's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly who you are. And I'm not leaving until this place is shut down." A man stepped out of the shadows, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that radiated from him. There was something cold and calculating in his gaze, something that sent a chill down Derek's spine. Kaleb didn't flinch. "You've been running this city long enough. Tonight, it ends." The man smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You think you're the first to try and take us down?" Kaleb's response was quick, his gun never wavering. "And you think you're the last?" Before anyone could react, the doors behind them slammed open, and Derek's blood ran cold. The sudden blast of noise from the open door sent Derek's heart racing. Gunfire echoed from the hallway, a barrage of shots that rattled the metal structure of the warehouse. The flash of muzzle fire illuminated the dark space like a strobe light, and Derek instinctively dropped to the ground, his mind scrambling to process what was happening. Kaleb didn't flinch. His training kicked in immediately as he hit the floor beside Derek, pulling him behind cover. "Stay down," he shouted, voice sharp. The two officers scrambled to find cover, ducking behind a stack of crates. As bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls around them, Derek's pulse was a steady drumbeat in his ears. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat. His instincts kicked in, he checked his weapon, ensuring the magazine was secure, then peered cautiously around the crate. A dozen men, mercenaries, by the looks of them, had burst into the room, all armed with automatic rifles. They moved with military precision, flanking the warehouse and forcing Kaleb and Derek into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The crack of gunfire was deafening, and Derek's thoughts raced. These weren't the low-level thugs they had anticipated. These men were trained, professional, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. Kaleb's eyes locked onto Derek's. Without a word, he motioned toward a nearby window, where a beam of moonlight cut through the darkness. It was their way out, but it wouldn't be easy. Every exit had been compromised. If they were going to survive this, they would need to make it through the chaos, and fast. "Follow me," Kaleb muttered under his breath. His voice was calm despite the storm of bullets around them. He was in his element, and Derek, despite his rising fear, followed without hesitation. Kaleb surged forward, diving from cover to cover. Derek moved with him, his back against the wall, his breath coming in short bursts. Kaleb led him through the maze of crates, always staying one step ahead. His movements were methodical, precise. It was clear that this was a man who had seen it all. His instincts were sharp. And he knew exactly where to go and when to move, but Derek couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. The sense of being trapped. They had underestimated the syndicate, and now they were paying the price. Kaleb had been so certain, so confident that they could take down this operation. But this was no longer just a raid, it was a fight for their lives, they reached a large steel door at the back of the warehouse, Kaleb quickly typing in the code to open it. The door buzzed, unlocking with a loud mechanical sound. The moment it opened, Kaleb didn't hesitate. He charged through, Derek right behind him. They found themselves in a narrow hallway, with more doors lining both sides. This place was a fortress. Kaleb's eyes scanned the area quickly, assessing their options. "We need to find a way to take out their communications," he muttered. "Otherwise, we're dead." Derek's mind was racing, but he trusted Kaleb's lead. The man was calm under pressure, and in this chaos, that was exactly what Derek needed. But something didn't sit right. As they moved down the hallway, Derek glanced at the walls, noting the reinforced steel doors, the security cameras that tracked their every move. This was more than just a criminal syndicate. This was a full-scale operation, built to withstand attacks like the one they were making. They turned a corner and came face to face with two armed guards. Derek's heart skipped a beat, but Kaleb was already moving. With lightning speed, he grabbed one of the guards, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him into the wall. The guard grunted in pain, his gun clattering to the floor as Kaleb disarmed him in one swift motion. Derek was on the other guard before he could even raise his weapon, knocking the man to the ground with a hard shove. The two guards were neutralized, but Derek's chest was tightening. His pulse was erratic, his body drenched in sweat. He could hear the mercenaries closing in, their footsteps echoing from the hallways. They were running out of time. Kaleb didn't pause. He grabbed Derek by the arm and yanked him forward. "Keep moving," he barked, his voice urgent. "We need to hit the communications room. It's just ahead." They moved with purpose, their footsteps muffled by the thick walls and the rain pouring down outside. Kaleb's eyes were sharp, scanning every shadow, every corner. Derek kept his gun ready, his heart in his throat. They were close now. So close to taking down the syndicate. Then, just as they reached the communications room door, it slammed open. A burst of gunfire sent both officers diving for cover, the bullets sparking against the walls and the floor. "Ambush!" Kaleb shouted. Derek's instincts took over as he dove behind a stack of crates. The firefight erupted in full force. Bullets whizzed past him, ricocheting off the walls. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, his hand tight around his gun. He returned fire, taking out one of the mercenaries as he darted across the room. The man collapsed in a heap, but there were more. So many more. Kaleb was moving like a ghost, his body fluid as he dropped another mercenary with a shot to the chest. Derek fired again, narrowly missing his target as the mercenary ducked behind cover. The fight had escalated beyond anything Derek had imagined. This wasn't just a raid, it was an all-out war, but in the midst of the chaos, Derek caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. A figure, tall, imposing, stood at the back of the room, watching the battle unfold. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but Derek knew instantly who it was the man who had spoken earlier. The one Kaleb had called out. The leader of the syndicate, and he wasn't alone. A dozen more mercenaries flanked him, each one armed and ready for a fight. Kaleb's voice cut through the gunfire. "We need to end this now." Derek could only nod. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. The room had become a war zone, with no clear winner in sight. Kaleb looked at Derek, his gaze intense. "You ready to end this?" Derek swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his weapon. His body was screaming at him to run, but there was no escape. This was the moment. The fight for the city was happening right here, right now. They didn't have much time. The syndicate was closing in, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. Kaleb took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the leader. "Let's finish this." With a final breath, Derek followed him into the fray. The battle intensified as the last of the mercenaries continued to fire from every angle. The sound of gunshots, explosions, and shouts echoed through the warehouse, creating a chaotic symphony of war. Derek's body was covered in sweat, his muscles burning from the constant movement. Every breath he took felt like a struggle, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were this close. Kaleb was in his element, moving with a lethal precision that Derek couldn't help but admire. Every shot he fired was calculated, every movement deliberate. But the syndicate's leader was still standing, still watching, and Derek knew that Kaleb's real target hadn't yet been eliminated. The man in the shadows, he was the key. He was the one orchestrating the entire operation, pulling the strings that had kept this city in a chokehold for so long. And Kaleb had made it clear that tonight, that chokehold was going to break. Derek's thoughts were interrupted as Kaleb suddenly gestured for him to move. Without a second thought, Derek followed, moving quickly across the room. They had to close the distance. They had to stop him. But the mercenaries were relentless, pouring fire from every corner, forcing them to take cover behind a set of crates. "Cover me!" Kaleb shouted. Derek immediately lifted his gun, scanning for any threats. A mercenary popped his head out from behind a pillar, and Derek took the shot, sending the man tumbling to the ground. But there were more. There would always be more. The leader's men were relentless. Kaleb moved with deadly intent, a predator closing in on its prey. Derek could hear the heavy thud of Kaleb's boots as he made his way forward. The leader didn't seem surprised by the push. They both knew this was the final confrontation. This was the point where the stakes were highest, where lives hung in the balance, and then it happened. Kaleb lunged forward, aiming straight at the leader. The man smirked, his eyes glinting with arrogance as he drew his own weapon. But Kaleb was faster. In a blur of motion, he disarmed the man with a fluid twist of his wrist, knocking the gun from his grasp and sending him sprawling to the floor. "Thought you had me?" Caleb's voice was cold, almost mocking as he towered over the leader. The man struggled to rise, his face contorting in frustration. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "There's more coming. You'll never." Before he could finish his sentence, Caleb's fist connected with his face in a brutal punch, knocking the man unconscious. Derek watched, his eyes wide. He had seen Kaleb in action before, but this was different. This was pure rage. As the leader crumpled to the floor, Derek took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. The mercenaries in the room seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. But the hesitation didn't last long. Kaleb was still standing, and his weapon was raised, his stance unwavering. The remaining mercenaries knew the end was near. They had no more reinforcements, no more tricks up their sleeves. The fight was lost, and they knew it. One by one, they dropped their weapons, their eyes filled with defeat. The warehouse, once filled with the sounds of chaos, was eerily quiet now. Caleb's chest heaved as he scanned the room, his eyes cold and calculating. But Derek noticed the smallest shift in his expression, a flicker of something darker. The adrenaline was wearing off, and in its place, something else was surfacing. Something Derek couldn't quite place. And then Caleb's gaze met his. It was intense, calculating, as if he were trying to gauge Derek's every thought. "You did good," Kaleb said, his voice quieter than before, almost casual. Derek nodded, though his mind was still spinning. He didn't trust Kaleb completely, not yet. Something didn't sit right. But for now, there was no time for questions. They had accomplished their mission. The syndicate was finished. The city was safe, but as Derek looked around at the fallen mercenaries and the unconscious leader at his feet, something clicked into place. He had heard whispers before, rumors that Kaleb had been involved with the syndicate in the past. It was impossible to ignore the thought now that they were standing in the aftermath of their raid. Could Kaleb have been playing a deeper game all along? Derek's gaze drifted to the leader's still form, his mind racing. What if Kaleb had orchestrated this whole thing? What if the raid had been a setup, a way for Kaleb to eliminate his enemies and take control of the syndicate himself? What if? Kaleb seemed to read Derek's thoughts, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You're thinking too much. We won. This is over." Derek didn't respond immediately. He didn't know if he could trust Caleb's words. Not after everything he'd seen. But one thing was clear, Kaleb wasn't just a police officer. Not anymore. He had become something more, and in that moment, Derek realized he didn't know who Kaleb really was. The man standing in front of him could be a hero, or he could be something far more dangerous. And Derek wasn't sure if he was ready to find out which. The sirens outside grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. The authorities would take control of the scene, take the leader into custody, and start cleaning up the mess that had been made. But Derek and Kaleb? They would walk away from it all, leaving the answers behind. As Derek glanced at Kaleb one last time, he knew one thing for certain: this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths, because in this world of shadows and deception, there were no easy answers. Only the relentless pursuit of power, and those who would stop at nothing to get it. And there you have it. What began as a routine police operation turned into a mind-bending journey filled with twists, betrayals, and explosive revelations. Kaleb, a man Derek once trusted above all, was not who he seemed to be. The shocking truth of his past came to light, revealing a darker side to the world they thought they knew. As the dust settles, Derek is left questioning everything. Was Kaleb ever truly a hero, or was he always playing a much bigger game? What do you think? Could you have ever seen this coming? Or did Kaleb's secret take you completely by surprise? Thank you so much for sticking with us through this wild ride. I hope you enjoyed this video and the story. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends, because there's so much more to come. Stay tuned for the next chapter, and as always, leave your thoughts and predictions in the comments below. Who knows what's next for Derek and Kaleb?